Hello, everybody. I'm Thomas Röske. I'm the director of the Prinzhorn collection, a famous collection of artworks by mentally ill people and people with exceptional psychic experience, you could say. I'm also the president of the European Outsider Association, and I was invited to give a talk here, and I chose the topic outsider art like any other. Because there is a big discussion at the moment about the term outsider art and what it means, and if it's really helpful to promote the art it means to promote. Could I have the next slide, please? And the next slide. I start with Jean Dubuffet, although I know that Sarah Lombardi already talked about the collection in Lausanne, because he was, of course, instrumental for bringing up the idea or bringing together the idea, which was the foundation of what we call outsider art nowadays. He was very much inspired by certain psychiatrists who, after the First World War, told people that those artworks by mentally ill people, which were called mad art at that period, were not only interesting out of diagnostical aspects, but also as aesthetical entities. And they were maybe even a model for what art could be after the First World War. Especially Hans Prinzhorn, who published a book called Artistry of the Mentally Ill in 1922, was very interested in installing those artworks as a kind of counter art to the art of his time, which had somehow not done enough against the madness of the World War, you could say. And Dubuffet took up that idea later and tried to install what he called art brut from 1945 as a kind of counter movement to cultural arts. So it was a fighting term, you could say. And he said that art brut was the real art. And it was that art which didn't know that it was art. And he called professional art a kind of quite shady kind of art because it sounded a bit like professional love. Art should be innocent somehow in his eyes and should maybe not know about itself. He was inspired by those psychiatrists, but soon he declared that the artworks he was interested in, although he looked for them first in psychiatric hospitals mainly, were not confined to the idea of artworks by mentally ill people. And famously, in his writing La Brute préférée aux arts culturels, which he published in 1949. He said, there is no more an art of insane people than there is an art by dyspeptic people or people with knee problems. So he declared that art brut was something which could happen to every inspired, creative person. He built up that collection, which nowadays is in Lausanne. And as I said, a lot of these artworks were done by mentally ill people. For example, also this work by Jean Marchand, which came out of a mental hospital. But there were also mediumistic drawings and paintings, for example, artworks by people who thought they were doing things under the guidance of spirits from the other side of reality, for example. He claimed that these artworks were mainly done by common people, and he was looking for an artist who was a common people. Outside art was for a long time an artist's art, you could say. It wasn't collected by big collectors. It wasn't sold in galleries. It was mainly taken up by artists who were inspired by it. And this situation only changed slightly over the decades. Jean Dubuffet gave his collection over to the city of Lausanne in 1971, and that was the period around 1970 when the first galleries were interested in this field as well. And especially American galleries became interested and started to specialize in dealing with art brut. So that made it important to publish a book in English about art brut, and that was, can I have the next slide, please? That was published in 1972 by a professor for Romanesque languages who was a specialist in surrealism, Roger Cardinal, who taught at the University of Canterbury. He intended just to write a book about art brut, and in the whole book he just talks about art brut, but his publisher said, we can't call a book for the English-speaking market art brut. We have to invent an own title, a translation, and suggested outsider art, and Cardinal accepted that. So the idea is outsider art is a pure translation of art brut, an art which is outside of the traditional and contemporary movements of art, something different, which is different from cultural arts. And it's not so much an art of outsiders of society, although in a lot of cases, those people who produce this art are outsiders of society as well. But the book also indicates the set-in of the commercial market, you could say. For me, it's a commercial term as well, because under the flag of outside art, suddenly the whole commercial art world set in. There were more and more galleries. From the beginning of the 90s, there was even an own art fair for outsider art in New York, later also in Paris. And there were a lot of collectors now specializing on outsider art, especially in the American world, but also in Europe later. Could I have the next slide, please? In the same year as Roger Cardinal published this book in 1972, 50 years ago, on the documenta 5, Harald Zeman showed for the first time art brut. But he wasn't able to call it art brut because Dubuffet denied him to use the term. Although later he said on the documenta 5, art brut was somehow institutionalized in the art world. He had this idea that this was art brut, but he had to call it differently, and he chose the term which Prinzhorn chose, artistry of the mentally ill. And he showed mainly artworks by mentally ill people, even with diagnostical ideas behind it, but he showed it in the Neue Galerie, and he showed it together with other artists under the term individual mythologies, individuelle Mythologien. And that was a kind of help for a lot of people to somehow starting to understand these quite special worlds of these artists who followed their own ideas. For example, could we get back to the former slide? Is it possible? Roger Cardinal chose for the cover of his book an artwork by Adolf Worthley, who had become prominent by an art book by a psychiatrist in 1921, Walter Morgenthaler, who published a monograph about him. He was obsessively working on books about reinventing his own life. And this picture, which you can see here, is a quite typical Worthley, where he invents his own future. It's part of a story of his own future. The next slide, please. On the documenta 5, the main object of this artistry of the mentally ill section was a reconstruction of the cell of Adolf Worthley. So Adolf Worthley was meanwhile already the most prominent art brut artist, you could say, in Europe. And Zeman also acknowledged that with the installation. But he not only showed pictures by Worthley, like other people had done before, but he showed the pile of his books. And I think for a lot of people that also gave a possibility to compare these artworks with other artworks of contemporary artists at that time, for example, other conceptual artists. In a way, you could see Worthley, who was incessantly working on his books as a kind of conceptual artist, although he had a very special and quite intriguing own idiosyncratic idea behind it, which was different to other artworks which were of the documenta at the same time. I want to come to that to explain what's special at this artworks we call outsider art, at least at a lot of them. Can we have the next slide, please? Oh, no, I forgot. I wanted to say there is this criticism nowadays about the term outsider art, and a lot of people try to bring in other terms. For example, Lynn Cook, with her big exhibition in 2018, tried to install the term outliers. Or just recently, this year, Lisa Slominski published a book which was called Non-Conformers. They have all weaknesses, these terms. Non-conformers seems to indicate that these people really choose to be outside of the norm, but usually they don't. And outliers is quite similar to outsider artists, but maybe not that catching a phrase. This term has helped a lot of people to become visible within the art world. The art world usually works with these kind of labels, and if you are not fitting into a label, it's hard for the art world to recognize you as something. And the term outsider art, which is on now for 50 years, has helped a lot of artists to become visible, to be seen and to be recognized. And it was quite helpful. And I would argue maybe it's not the right time to change a running horse, although a lot of people try to do that. The next slide, please. On this documenta, for example, there is this term neurodiverse art, introduced especially by the project Artworks. They introduced, it's a studio from London, they introduced some other studios as well. For example, you can see on the top some artworks from the Atelier Goldstein in Frankfurt, and they take up the term neurodiverse Kunst, they say now. And of course, it's a term which could be somehow more democratic because we are all neurodiverse in a way. But although the term is quite fashionable now in Great Britain, it mainly signifies people with mental handicaps or people who have autism. So when you use that term, usually it denotes that, and it's not used as a kind of democratic term in a way, although it tries to be that. In a way, you could also say we are all outsiders, but that doesn't help really in bringing attention to a certain kind of artworks. And now I want to explain what's special with outsider art at some examples, which are quite large to make it more clear what can be behind what we call outsider art. Can I have the next slide, please? In 2014, Harald Bender, who also called himself Adelhüt van Bender and Marquis von Kensington, died. He had tried to build up a bourgeois career, first as a mechanic or an electrician, but then he somehow didn't work enough. He said he didn't give results enough, and he had to stop working as an electrician. Then he wanted to become an artist, at least a kind of information designer. That was his idea, and he went to the Art Academy in Berlin, but he also didn't give enough results, he said, and he was exmatriculated. He was pushed out of the academy. And then he had different times in psychiatric hospitals. And fortunately, he could afford to live alone in a one-room apartment. And he obsessively worked on one topic then for the next decades from the 70s, namely to show that there was a connection between the atom, for him light energy, and the ovulation. You could say he was looking for the offspring of us all. He was also looking for the offspring of him, because he was, as you can already see from the name, not clear if he was really male or female. He was looking for proofs. And in fact, he called what he did as drawings, and you can see himself in a room with a lot of files piled up around the walls of his one room. Each of these files contained about at least 200 drawings, and there were, when he died, more than 2,500 files. He tried to employ all kinds of academic disciplines to work through this idea of the connection of the atom of ovulation. And he used a lot of symbols he invented himself, and he copied these drawings, he reworked these drawings, and he produced these millions of drawings still working on this topic. You could say it sounds a bit like a kind of artistic research, but it was more for him. For him, it was somehow a kind of life prothesis. He had somehow lost contact to reality, and he tried to reinstall that and to reinstall a kind of grab of reality with the help of art and creativity. Can we have the next slide, please? I just show you some other artworks by him which were also done within this research project. When I talked to him, he was incessantly talking in a pseudo-academic Kauderwelsch, you would say. I said, "This is great art, we should exhibit that." And he said, "No, this is not art. These are proofs. And this is an academic research, and we have to show this to people who can judge about that." In fact, he wanted to give it to a kind of court in Berlin, where already a judge collected some of his works. The next slide, please. Another very impressive example, I think, is Wanda Vera Schmidt, a Berlin woman, half Portuguese, who was born in 1949. She was born in Berlin, but she grew up on Madeira. She came back to Berlin with 16 as an au pair girl. Then she tried to keep herself afloat with a restaurant, a Portuguese restaurant, and a beauty salon. But then she told this story. She made the mistake of her life. She somehow let her in with Mick Jagger, who became her lover. And Mick Jagger took all her money until she had no money left. And then one day she sat at the border of a pedestrian way and she was crying, and a policeman came along and said, "In Germany, it's not allowed to cry," and took her into a psychiatric hospital. And she was there for 2 years. In the art therapy section, she learned creativity, she learned how to draw, and that she liked it. And then she, as her illness didn't become really better and her reality sense didn't become really better, she came into a care home, big care home with other ex-patients. And she lived there from 1995 to 2005, when they had to move to another facility. And only then the carers discovered that the basement was full of paper, and these paper were all drawings. Most of these paper had drawings on both sides. And one of these carers had heard about the Prinzhorn collection, and they called me and they asked me, "We have this kind of piles of drawings here, could that be art?" And then I went to Berlin and looked at it, and I heard the story. This is Wanda Vera Schmidt in the background. She is convinced that with her work, she is somehow fighting the fighting against the endangerment of peace. She is sure that her work somehow ensures peace in the world. She is sure that she works together with the German army. She's sure that when there is a conflict in the world, the Ministry of Defense should call her. She should send a drawing there. There is a computer which can read this drawing as a colored video. It would help to solve the political problem, but then it had to be sent back because nothing has to be lost. I found this story amazing, that somebody with her creativity is fighting the disquietness about the endangerment of world peace. And I said, we have to rescue this work. Can I have the next slide, please? We showed it in the lobby of the Prinzhorn collection, piled up with the help and stabilized with the help of a chair and a table, like it was in the basement, as you can see here. The next slide, please. There you can see the installation in the Prinzhorn collection, quite dark, sorry. Then we showed it 2 years. Can I have the next slide, please? The drawings are mostly quite simple. This on the left-hand side is a piece of uranium. She has to repeat it so often that all the lines are straight, and then she has power about it and can neutralize it. And on the right-hand side, it's a kind of pendulum figure, which she always does before she has an encounter to make sure that it's a good encounter. Can I have the next slide, please? There are more complicated drawings in it, and probably there are wonderful drawings in it, but unfortunately we couldn't look through all these 500,000 pieces of paper to find them. We showed it for 2 years in these piles, and then we sent it around for 2 years in different museums. Can we have the next slide, please? And then we found a place for it. The newly refurbished and opened Museum for Military History in Dresden took it. Can I have the next slide, please? It's great because they take the message seriously. They show it in this new wing of the military museum, and they explain the story with it. And they have a lot of artworks. They take it seriously as an artwork, but with a very special meaning. But Wanda Vera Schmidt also showed her work in New York. Can I have the next slide, please? Because Massimiliano Gioni, you will know his name as the curator of the documenta 55 in 2013. He shows a lot of outsider art in his shows in the New York New Museum, and he made a show. Can I have the next slide, please? In 1617, which was called The Keeper. It was a show about artists who collect. And she was there with her message as well. The message was explained. I think that's very important because otherwise you would mistake this work again with a kind of conceptual piece. But for her, it's very, as you have imagined already with my explanation, she has a kind of magical message. She can create a kind of magic result with her drawings. She is somehow keeping an equilibrium in the world, which makes her, of course, very important. It's also a kind of message out of a woman who feels really disempowered. She has now power, and she uses it to keep up her self-esteem, but also to keep up her reliance on reality, you could say. And I think these two works, these two installations, you could say, are typical works of outsider art. It's something which is beyond what we usually expect in artworks. Usually we do not expect that artists think they have magical powers or can influence world peace. And usually they don't give all their life in this kind of obsessiveness to one idea as these artists do. Can I have the next slide, please? You can show these works, I think, in different contexts with other artworks, of course, but I think it would be important also always to indicate the kind of context out of which these works come and the special ideas behind them. I'm an advocate for making a difference. We always talk about inclusion of people with psychic illnesses and people with disabilities, but inclusion should mean that we cherish the special character and the special message and the special beings which are behind these artworks. And for that reason, I think it's important always to point to these special contexts out of which these artworks come. I think one quite the documenta here is a good way of contextualizing outsider art, especially when you look at kind of leaving the idea of a prominent artist, but to look at groups of artists as well. And I think this works quite well here in the documenta. Another show which did quite well, I think, was a show which did the Silesian Museum in Katowice in 2017. It was called I'm No Longer a Dog. And it was about underground art from the 60s to the 90s. Can I have the next slide, please? The museum is mostly underground, as it is a museum in a town which was a kind of miners city. So this exhibition of underground art was also underground, you could say. And they showed a lot of different types of underground art. For example, this kind of more mystical art by somebody who is a musician and does these kind of spiritual drawings and paintings as well. Next slide, please. Or this works done by a prisoner who had a kind of academic career before, but was working with the reduced materials he could get in a prison in Poland when he worked on this series of drawings on the left-hand side. Next slide, please. But they also showed, for example, the artworks of this guy who obsessively takes out photographs and images out of newspapers and journals and mounts them with tape and with cardboard to make little entities out of it, like talisman. And he produces thousands of these talisman to make them more precious, you could say, like pictures of saints or so, nearly. Has a certain tradition in Poland that's probably also behind it. But it's an irrational idea, as I think, to embellish his life with the help of these. Can I have the next slide, please? And also these photographs, which somebody takes of himself, mimicking to be somebody else, especially female, of course reminds one of Cindy Sherman or other artists of the 20th century. But when you learn that he had made, he is a mechanic, he was not a trained artist, and he had made already 18,000 of these photographs, you can see that it's something else. It's really part of his life. It's existential for him in a stronger way than art usually is existential for artists. But it worked well to keep these different underground artworks together and to retell the story of the state of Poland with the help of these underground works, which illuminated different perspectives of these decades between 1960 and 1990. Could I have the next slide, please? What has changed from the times of Prinzhorn and of Dubuffet up to today, of course, is that a lot of artists who have no training, no academic education, can now work, and especially if they live in certain facilities, they have mental problems or have disabilities or so, they work in studios, supported studios they are usually called. And here I just give you an impression of one studio in Vienna, the Atelier 10, which has around 20 clients working there. Usually they are open to do whatever they want to, but when you look at different of these supported studios, you find after a while that they all have their style. There is a kind of studio style, different studio style. You can see that here as well, for example, with the arts project from London, that there is a certain kind of style, which is usually also due to the people working with the clients there. And a lot of these people working there have training, artist training, and consciously or unconsciously, they bring in certain ideas of what's art into these studios. And so they make those people who work there to produce art as that which you also can see in academies or in galleries or in museums. Some of these art assistants, as we call them in Germany, have even the idea that these studios are alternative academies. It's a long story now that a lot of academies try to include also outsider artists, but some of these studios try to become alternative academies to bring those people into the first art market, not only to present in outsider art galleries and outsider art fairs, but also in the art scene, in normal galleries and so on. But I'm afraid there could be something lost as well. I mean, I don't want to deny anybody ways of self-fulfillment and career, and it's great if people want to become artists who produce artworks for galleries and museums, like we can see it with academic artists as well, to help them to do that. The usual difference, I think, with outsider art and normal art or cultural art is that cultural art is usually just trying to show symbolic representations of realities or ideas or fantasies. Whereas these artists from the outsider art field often transgress this symbolic representation with more irrational ideas, with magical ideas or so. Can we have the next slide? One of the artists in the Atelier 10, for example, did this painting, which from the painting itself, with a mixture of informal and figurative painting, is not different from a lot of paintings which you can see in the art worlds or in academies. There is a writing on it which says, "The most tender place in my heart is for strangers," and that's a quote from a pop song by Nico Case from 2006. So it's somehow embarking, or it's somehow taking up certain cultural ideas, and it's enlarging on it. It makes a picture on a certain idea which is floating around in our culture. Next slide, please. When you compare it with another artist who was part of a supported studio, namely Gugging, but was quite self-standing, then we have quite different aspects there and characteristics. He also uses figurative painting and writing, but the writing he is using is quite personal. He's telling his own story because he thought that he was operated by the Russians from a girl into a two-penis boy. That's the story which he always tells in his paintings and in his drawings. And he's trying to embellish that and tell that also in this painting. So he's telling a very individual mythology, you could say, but a mythology which has no connection really to the culture around. The difference here is that the left-hand picture is rooted in culture, in everyday culture, and the right-hand picture is not really. It's trying to bring out a message which is quite idiosyncratic and personal to this guy, August Waller, who did it. Next slide, please. Stefan Wimreuter also is an artist who is quite versed in the ways of contemporary painting, I think. He has a gift in using the paint in a kind of illusionistic way and showing a face. This work, I think, is not really outsider art. It's done by somebody from a supported studio, but I wouldn't call it outsider art. But on the right-hand side, please, the next one. The one by Thomas Greza probably is, because it's just using the means this guy is able to put onto a drawing. He's using his means of formulating cars. It's a kind of succession of cars, obviously a street scene he wants to show. And he is doing it with with outlines. He's not doing a kind of illusionistic retina ready painting of reality, but he is reformulating reality like a kid would do. And what he's showing is he's showing the outlines. That's where you can touch the bodies. It's a kind of more tactile way of showing things, whereas the left-hand picture is more a kind of optical picture. The left-hand picture is more telling what he experiences when he thinks of certain bodies, comparing it probably also with his own body. Therefore, the entities are not overlapping. They are quite whole. And they should be whole because they shouldn't be damaged. To overlap these bodies would mean you would take something away, you would damage them. Can we have the next picture, please? I just explained that because you could wonder what's the difference between a Thomas Greza drawing and this Karl Appel painting. Karl Appel was a painter of the Cobra group, a group which took up this idea of Art Brut after the Second World War, a group which was named after the cities these artists came from, namely Copenhagen, Brussels, and Amsterdam. And Karl Appel was an Amsterdam artist, and they all shared the idea that they should again start art anew with the help of naive painting, of children's drawings, of drawings by mentally ill people. It was quite the same idea as Prinzhorn had, and they, of course, were in a choir, you could say, with Dubuffet as well. But what Karl Appel did was he transposed the idea of a children's drawing into a big painting with oil on canvas, something a child or a mentally handicapped person would never do. And it is quite big. It's 80 by 130 centimeters big. It's a big canvas, which is quoting this very reduced, flat way of showing entities, but without or nearly without contours. It's a more painterly vision of these kind of entities, of these kind of beings. And you can see even with the second figure, there is an overlapping. He's doing something which kids and mentally handicapped people would never do. So he's damaging a figure in the view of a naive onlooker, you could say. The question is, why would these drawings on the left-hand side by Thomas Greza probably have a hard time to make it into a museum, and why is the right painting in a museum? It's in the Tate collection, the Tate Britain in London, or Tate Modern. The right one is in the Tate Modern because it quotes the naivete and it quotes this very basic idea of figures and entities in space. It does not really show it as the only possibility of the artist, but you can see that he's just taking up the idea and transforms it into an artwork and therefore makes it into a kind of symbolic representation of what the original, you could say, the original drawing of somebody like Thomas Greza is showing. I don't know if you understand what I mean. I think that's a very important difference. It's the same with Klee, for example. Klee is also taking up certain ideas of children, and he is transforming them and giving them another meaning as a kind of metaphor in the art world. And you could say, why is that? Why don't these humble drawings by mentally ill or mentally handicapped or children don't have a chance in our art world to become entities in a museum? And I think that's a just question. I think they should be in a museum because they obviously tell a lot to people. People react to them and they can somehow relate to them and they can understand them. But to include them into the museums would mean to enlarge the idea of art. It's not just an entity which is optical before you when you have a picture, but it's also transporting some ideas about the tactile qualities, the touchability, the idea of physicality, which is much more prominent in drawings by children or mentally handicapped people, as at least by a lot of them. And we should cherish them as a kind of own idea of art, an own entity of art. And we should, if we want to include these works, which we call outsider art up to today, into the art world, we should also be ready to be confronted with artworks behind which are not the same ideas about the reality which we have, but completely different ideas, completely different concepts of functioning in the world, completely different concepts of how I can influence the world with magic, for example. The work by Van der Vera Schmidt, who secures world peace, it's hard to understand them beyond a kind of metaphorical message. We would think, of course, in her world, she thinks she is really magically influencing reality, but isn't it just a kind of metaphor? Isn't it that just a kind of metaphor what you can do with creativity? And I think, no, it's for her, it's not a metaphor, and we should somehow try to take it seriously also as being not just a metaphor. And therefore, I think when we really want to get serious with the idea of inclusion of artworks from this field of outsider art, we should be ready, we should be open for these other messages which these artworks bring into the art world. And we should be ready to open art beyond the idea of just being symbolical representations. That's the point I wanted to make. Thank you very much for your attention. Are there any questions? Yeah. Oh, a lot.
Hi.
Hi.
I do have a question about what is the will or the intent of the artist. So I can see this why not in the museum, and in the slide that you show in the end that there was this colorful painting from someone, and then the work from, I think it was Thomas, I don't remember the name.
Greza, yeah.
Yeah, that was in black and white. So for me, a question that arose from everything you have shown me is the intention of the woman from Portugal is to change the world. I don't know if she wanted also to be in a museum. And the first guy too, he wanted to kind of explain something that was very important for him, and he dedicated his life to that. So before, for me, questioning if that belongs or not in the museum, wouldn't be first the question, do these people want that work in the museum? Or we need to respect, like I found very interesting that the work from the Portuguese woman was in this military type museum where in a way was responding to her own request, right, as an artist.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an important question which has been somehow answered by Dubuffet already, who wanted to lift up these artworks, which, as he said, mostly were done by people who didn't think about art, into art. He wanted to create a kind of counter art to criticize the art of his time. And it's true, in a kind of Duchampian way, he took up these artworks and declared them, these works, and declared them to be art. Of course, it's a question, should we do that or shouldn't we do that? But it's done already. It's done in a lot of cases already. And I think we live in a time where we should try to integrate all kinds of minorities into a kind of we feeling, into a kind of perspective where we can say we fully integrate these people, we fully include these people. And I think art can be a big help in that respect, to integrate people with their certain perspectives into the reality of everybody. And I think we live in a time where the old idea of art as being just symbolic representation needs to be questioned as well. Some of these artists, outsider or producers of outsider art, say they're artists. And a lot of these artists who work in supported studios already have the idea that they are artists. They are told they are artists. And with that message comes a whole package of what to do as an artist, you could say. And I don't think we can, out of different reasons, we can turn the time back on that. These things are in the world already, and it's just, for me, it's just the question, how are these works included or integrated into the art world? And I think if you really want to include them, you have to listen to the works themselves, you have to listen to the people who did the works, and you have to try to do them justice in a way. The alternative would be to open up a different field of art-like works, which is somehow at the border of art. And as soon as you think about that, it becomes somehow uneasy, I think, to exclude these people and exclude this art. I would think we are in this situation, the works are there in the art world, and we should think about how to include them and somehow to prevent these works from just being artified in a way that they are misunderstood as something which they are not and which they are not intended to be. But it's an interesting discussion, I admit, yes. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for your wonderful lecture. You like the term outsider art. I don't like it at all, and I think today, just right now, it's the time to change the term. And I think it's also a little bit, I'm uneasy, and I think it's a little bit dangerous to work with terms like normal art and typical art, and this strong view on the interpretation of the art. And I think also, when I think, for example, of Adolf Worthley, and he wrote about a lot about his impressions on art, and on he thought a lot, and there are a lot of writings about art, and he wanted to see himself, he wanted to be seen as an artist. He wanted his dream that he gets exhibitions. He had a small exhibition, I think, in a restaurant or something like this, and he even wanted to that his small room in Waldau became a museum. And I think it would be great, and it's a matter of respect, when an artist like Adolf Worthley or perhaps different artists say, I am an artist. And so for me, there's just art. There's not outsider art, there's not normal art. I think the most important thing is the power of art, and the power of art is included in, so like you call it, normal art or typical outsider art. So I don't like this great difference between these two terms.
I understand what you want to say, and in principle, I would agree with you that it would be great if we could just call everything art, especially if the artist wants to call it art. But I see a kind of danger of what I would call outsider art being just colonized by the art world as something new, fresh, somehow perky, ragged, a bit different. but not really cherished for what it is and the message which is behind it. I don't care so much for the term of outsider art. I just want to point out that those works which I would still call outsider art have often a special meaning and a special intention, and we should try to respect this intention and to hear this intention and to listen to it. You could say the way I presented Wanda Vera Schmidt's work in our lobby, which was hard to see, I think it was quite dark, the image, was a mistake as well, because I somehow installed it in a way which I thought would look good as a kind of work. So in a way, I produced the artwork. I wanted to make it better when we reinstalled the work in Berlin. She was living in Berlin, and I had her beside me, and I asked her, how do you want the piles to be built up? She couldn't care less. It was completely irrelevant to her. She didn't think in these categories of installation. It was only important for her that everything was there. And this makes clear that there is a friction between the demands of the art world, there's somehow the categories we think in the art worlds, and the intention behind works which I would still call outsider art. And I would just, my plea would just be that curators who are interested in these works should really listen to what these works want to tell and how they want to be shown, and take up this kind of challenge to think in new ways of presenting works, which could be healthy for all installations of artworks. That's my idea. I agree that the term outside art can be misunderstandable as it seems to be indicating artworks by outsiders of society, and we don't want to call people outsiders of society, although other artists would also call themselves outsiders, and we all could tell we are somehow all outsiders. But as I tried to explain at the beginning, that this was not the intent of the term. The term was just trying to find an English translation for art brut, an art which is outside of the art world. But maybe there will be another term which will help to differentiate and to make people cautious before they just subsume these works into categories and visual entities which we are used to in the art world. That's the only thing I want to be against or want to speak against.
Hello. Thanks for a wonderful lecture, and I was pretty amazed on how you were so detailed about the stories of the artworks, and I was just wondering whether our dreams of inclusion or a fantasy of inclusion, it's actually based more on building a narrative, right? So that we can integrate things in terms of discourse, and whether, you know, that if you look at the materiality of the works, like, are they then ready to be sort of included? So my question is, how then you relate to how much we can talk and build a huge discourse on inclusion, but actually then looking at the works themselves.
If I understand correctly, you are advocating for just looking at the works and not at the stories behind the works. And you would argue that outsider art is mostly working with the story behind the works, and other works is not. Other artworks are not. But that's not true. First of all, you know a lot about artists like Picasso and so on. You know when he painted this painting, he was together with this woman and so on. You know a lot about that. And secondly, it's not true that you don't think about biography when you look at other artworks by professional artists or academic artists. You have just a kind of cliche in your head about the biography. You know that it's a work by a human being. It's not by an ape or so, it's by a human being. And you automatically assume that he is an intelligent, quite sensible being, which has the same ideas of reality as you have. In earlier times, people even thought mostly it's a work by a man and not by a woman. That was the cliche behind it. And I think it would be healthy to know more about artists and their worldview in general, to understand artworks. I think it's a myth that it's possible just to see quality and the meaning of artworks by the material appearance of the works. And secondly, I would think in a lot of cases of so-called outsider art, there are quite impressive stories behind it, which help to understand why these people have a very special worldview. And I think to understand certain characteristics of these works, in many cases, it's important to know about these stories and the context behind. So I think there is a lot to be said for or against the idea that outsider art is just an art which works through the life stories of the patients.
Okay, I would love to step back to the beginning of your talk. You showed an image of Harald Zeman, and related to what some people have mentioned already, finding or establishing alternative ways of presenting, showing these pieces by whoever it made, or to integrate it into an existing system. So that's, in my understanding, the big difficulty. Harald Zeman himself, he quitted with the art world completely in a way, and he was maybe, so to call himself, an outsider. So do you know more about his history, his alternative practice?
Well, he more and more concentrated on this idea of intensity as a quality marker. And but he already talked about this when he had his first exhibition with artworks by mentally ill people in 1963 in Bern. He said that the main criterion is intensity of quality of these works. And I think that became more and more his way of looking at things which he called art or which he was interested in. He not really quitted the art world, but he produced shows which questioned the usual way of approach to art. And he also did it with the help of provoking juxtapositions in these big shows about Swiss eccentrics, for example, or about Belgium eccentrics. That was 2005, I think, his last show he did. He also included a lot of artworks from the field of art brut or outsider art. It is a kind of common denominator to say there is a certain kind of intensity in it, and also the idea of individual mythologies was an attempt to build a bridge. But in a way, he didn't exhibit the works differently, and he didn't really question the way the things were presented in a white cube. He just tried to establish another approach through juxtapositions. And I think that was quite a step already and made people aware of similarities and made them become a bit disquiet about what really is that which usually is called art. But I think one could go a bit further nowadays. He was a very big inspirator for the new ways of looking at art, and especially of art at the fringes of art, the art world. But I don't think it's the last step you can take.
Hi, thank you for all the information. It's very inspiring, and that just made me think of two very famous artists. One is Japanese artist called Yayoi Kusama, and another is Niki Sanfal from France. And these two artists have very serious mental illness, and I would like to hear about what do you think about them? Are they outsider artists, or they're like, because they're very famous and they're
Yeah.
already included? Yeah.
There is another very famous artist who was very often in psychiatric hospital. That's Agnes Martin. And I would neither call her nor Yayoi Kusama nor Isa Gensken, for example, who had psychiatric experience as well, outsider artists. They have found a way to fit into the art world, into the development of contemporary art movements. Especially Agnes Martin is one of the classic minimalist artists. You could say maybe this way of building grids and just build up paintings out of horizontal lines is somehow putting a kind of order into her turmoiled inside world or so. Maybe it did help her, maybe it had a soothing effect on her, but that's not that important for the development of the art world, I think. And for that reason, they fit too well into the movements of contemporary art to be called outsider artists. That's the pure and very simple answer to your question. And Yayoi Kusama, I mean, she is really making her career out of telling everybody that she's living in a psychiatric hospital. She is really clever in doing that, I would think, yes. But it doesn't make psychiatric experience doesn't make an outsider artist out of artists, I would think.
Yeah, I just have a very quick question, and I'm not sure if that would repeat anything because I was late, and maybe you already said something to that. If so, I'm sorry. When you mentioned I think they're called like the Cobra Collective, the Cobra Collective.
Yeah.
Or you were like comparing outsider art to
a painting by Apple.
yeah, that is like inspired by this outsider art. Would you say that is, or is your opinion that is rather problematic, that non-outsider artists are kind of taking this art style and making things with it and like using it for is that some kind of appropriation, or
you could call it appropriation, but that's a typical way of making art since pop art, you could say, appropriation. I wouldn't deny anybody to use whatever language one wants to use, and why shouldn't people take that up? There are some, recently I just got a post from a gallerist who deals with outsider art, and he's complaining about so many artists nowadays copy outsider art and just using this style and so on. No, I wouldn't complain. I would think it's important to make differences, and I think it is still possible also to make differences and maybe even to see differences in the artworks. But why shouldn't people take up certain ideas and make something out of it in their own art? They transpose it into something else, probably. If there is any characteristic which makes you question if something, or makes you think if something is done by somebody who is an outsider artist or does outsider art, then it's the coming together of an urge to say something, to tell something, to express something, and the obvious not being equipped for it in an academic way. I would always argue you could see in a picture, for example, of an outsider artist that he is running across all stop signs which are telling him, you can't do it, you're not equipped for it, because he wants to do it. He wants to work on certain ideas. He wants to express something, and he is taking up all means he is able to get from his past or whatever he can do. In many cases, he's quite often, these people are quite original and they're inventing the wheel again in their own way, you could say. But there is this tension between wanting to say something and the not being really equipped for it, which you can sense in some artworks. And I would think when some professional artist takes up certain styles, you can see that this is missing. For example, when you go into this space here with the artworks from Cuba, from outsider artists, I think many of them will tell you this, that these people cannot just choose their style. They just have to use their means to express what they want to say. When you get into a supported studio and compare the way people there, in most cases, work to, for example, art students, there is a big difference often. A professional artist would always hesitate, and because his mind is full of inhibitions. He just knows exactly what he should not do. He should not maybe do figurative paintings. He should not use this or that color because that's too fashionable. He shouldn't use this abstraction because other people have done it already. He knows exactly where he has to react to what he has to react to with his work. And those people who produce outside art, as I would call it, don't hesitate. In many cases, they just sit down and they start to draw because this is what they can, this is what they know how to do, and they don't know any alternatives. They just use their means. That's a big difference, and that's maybe also showing in the works. I would predict that you could see that as I try to show it in the comparison between Greza and Karel Appel.
I don't know if you can take other questions. You okay?
Yeah, okay.
I was wondering, what do you think about the current status of art brut? And we have seen in the last years also forms of spectacularization of it. And I'm thinking of the Museum of Everything, the way it was shown, in Venice. And we had the possibility to discuss with Sara Lombardi what she thought about this. So I would be curious about, your stand of it. On the other side, I'm also worried about the way you suggested art should be approached, also by knowing more about the biography of the artist. And I read all the texts, possibly the ones at least published by Agnes Martin.
Yeah.
And, if she heard what you said, she would turn in the grave, I think, because she would not say that her art was a therapy, and indeed is a result of many false readings, that she was connected to minimalism, because she always defined herself as an abstract expressionist. So she was always close to Ad Reinhardt, Clifford Steele, and totally another world, so very far from minimalism. So it's a false art historical reading, which I hope in 20, maybe 50 years will be corrected and amended, and people will really look at what she wrote and how she felt, and the people she hanged out were abstract expressionists. And so I was wondering, two questions. How you feel art brut is presented nowadays, whether there's a lot to do still, or we are running the risk of spectacularizing. So I very much admire what Tanya has been doing for this exhibition. And on the other side, I was wondering how the biography of an artist should inform the work, They're not easy questions.
No. To answer the first question, you were talking about the Museum of Everything by James Pratt. He is somebody who is presenting his collection in a quite spectacular and wanting to be funny way in many cases. And this is just one way of presenting these artworks. I'm quite uneasy with that, feel uneasy with that. And but he has also done some interesting attempts to reconstruct the ways these artists wanted to see their works. And I think some of his attempts to reconstruct, of these reconstructions, are quite interesting. For example, Amory Blackton. Amory Blackton is somebody who did healing machines, kind of metal objects which were hanging in a shed, and they were all meant for this shed. The shed was filled with these healing machines, these metal objects. And after his death, these metal objects were often sold singularly and are shown in shows singularly. And I think that's not really appropriate and what they were meant for. And he tried to reconstruct with a lot he had, a bit of this shed feeling. And I thought that was a good move he did. So I'm half in being critical. And I didn't want to say that Agnes Martin's art can just be understood with her biography. You misunderstood me. I think her art just fits into the art of her time. I have problems to see it as a kind of abstract expressionism, but if that's what she wanted to see her work, okay. But it fits into the time of the 50s up to the 70s, and it is not a need to talk about the biography. It could, I mean, with many other artists, you could also put in different ways of interpretation, and these ways of interpretation could somehow give a combined view on the artist, and they can stand beside each other, but they can also make a new whole out of the view on an artist. And I think it doesn't damage her work to talk about her psychiatric experience. In fact, I don't think it's a damage for anybody to talk his or her mental experience. And I think it would be important that many more people talk about their mental experience. I think I even would advocate for outing. It would be good to out more people who had mental experience, to tell the world that it's not such a bad thing to have psychic problems, and that that you're not an outcast with it. It hits a lot of people, and it also hits a lot of prominent people. And it could be good if we talk about the psychiatric experience behind works where it really has a meaning or is meaningful, to help to get rid of the stigma of mental illness and mental problems. No questions anymore? Thank you very much.